Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Very happy to be joined today by Josh Blank, research director of the Texas Politics Project. Welcome back, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
Well, what to talk about today? Obviously, at the top of the agenda would be the Dobbs v. Jackson decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade at the federal level, which was handed down late last week as we record Wednesday morning here in Texas. We talked about this a lot.
Yeah. Now, in the past. Again.
Right. I mean, certainly not the first time we've talked about it on the podcast, given, what was a lot of activity around this issue in the Texas legislature in the last session last year. As it turns out, that was not the case that went before the court.
Right.
But Texas did have a trigger law on the books, meaning that, which had the contingency, should Roe be overturned by the Supreme Court, that at least in the law, 30 days after
the opinion is officially
the
issued.
Opinion was officially handed down, not just the opinion itself announced, that abortion, that abortion would be banned in Texas, and that the operative laws in the state would then go into effect. Now, that's been complicated.
Right.
The day of the decision, the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, issued an advisory, on one hand saying that the trigger law was not quite in effect because of that 30-day provision, but also saying that local authorities may well begin enforcing a ban on abortion that had been on the books in Texas, prior to Roe v. Wade, going back to the 1920s, 1925, I think.
Well, this is an ongoing question about the fallout of this, is that basically any case that was overturned kind of through the logic of the Roe v. Wade penumbra of privacy rights, et cetera, Griswold, and so on and so forth.
Right.
Do they go back? And there's this is sort of I think, as I understand, this is sort of an ongoing case of kind of like, or aspect of law to try to understand. So these cases, all these laws automatically go back on the books.
Right. So and in fact, there's right now, the implementation of that 1920s law has been enjoined by a court.
Right.
Has been blocked by a court for the time being.
Well, and the main point here is the main point here is that may sort of, I don't know, sort of fun. I mean, it's not.
Well, I don't know that it's the main point, but
a point of it would just to be to say that's going on. And to the extent that that's sitting in the court system, ultimately the trigger law is going to circumvent that sooner than later.
I think that's the general expectation, and all that really does is roll you back to the 6-week ban,
right,
that was passed by the legislature. Right. As such, when
a lot of abortion clinics,
for what would seem to be a few days. I mean, per the coverage anyway. And it's not even, and the effect of that decision is not even universal across the state.
Right.
It only applies to a set of clinics that were plaintiffs in that appeal.
And some clinics are already just stopping providing services already at this point, basically because of the uncertain legal environment.
Right. Well, I think my understanding is everybody had stopped. Now those that were parties to this motion that resulted in will now go back to at least complying with the 6-week law that was passed, the 6-week limit that was passed in the last legislature, to say nothing of the bounty system and all of these other things that are going on. So, obviously, we have a lot of polling on this. And one of the things that we've said going forward, and, I think, not to foreshadow where we arrive here, this will be, pick your term, an inflection point, a watershed, we think. I mean, certainly it is policy-wise. Whether it is attitudinally, it's certainly going to change the way that we poll on this. But one of the things that we've said all along is that the basic patterns in public attitudes have been stable for a long time.
Yeah, remarkably so. I mean, what I'd often say, because look, Texas has passed a lot of laws to limit abortion over the last decade, in which we've been polling, in which we've tested, lots of sort of generic questions, very specific questions. And I think the thing that I always say when there's sort of a reaction to a new law or something that sort of seems to really push the bounds of wherever the discussion was is, there'd be sort of this question out in the ether. It's like, well, does this change things? And the answer is, well, no. Most of the time, the answer has been no. And the reason I would give is that, well, for the most part, people know what they think about abortion in a general sense. Again, whether they think deeply about it, but at a very sort of high level, we talk about, generally orientations, pro-life, pro-choice, should people be able to access abortions, never or not, that kind of thing. I think people generally know where they are. And the strategy, by Republican and conservative legislators to chip away at abortion access doesn't really necessarily result in a big change in the way that people think about abortion, right? The fundamentals. And what does that look like? Over, I guess, 14 surveys that we conducted up until last April, no more than 17% of Texas voters have ever said that abortion should never be accessible.
Right.
And that's sort of, I think, the overarching headline kind of takeaway about where opinions stood kind of going up to the eve of this decision is that, very few Texans think that, no one should ever access an abortion. The plurality of Democrats consistently, nearly 70%, usually say that basically it's a matter of personal choice, that, the circumstances don't matter, but that's kind of where Democrats are. On the flip side, 1 in 5 Republican women have consistently supported access as a matter of personal choice. So at the Democratic position on this, as opposed to 1 in 10 Republican men. And again, this has been consistent throughout the entirety of the time that we've been polling. The trigger law that you mentioned, we've consistently found, we've asked it 4 times up until last April. And we found that at least 53% of Texas voters have expressed opposition to the outright ban each time, with no more than 37% of voters saying they support an automatic ban on abortion. And so that's sort of, I think, what we think of as kind of the set piece.
Right.
Right? As sort of where we are now that abortion is legal. It's important to know that most Texans don't think that abortion should be inaccessible. The vast majority think it should be accessible across, and we can also say from other polling that we've done, across a range of circumstances. And that's important. So I think that's kind of the pattern. There's generally tends to be Republican support for most efforts to limit abortion access. There's certainly more Republican support for an overall ban. But again, even among Republicans, usually it's less than 1 in 5 would say that abortion should never be accessed, which is where we basically are at this moment in Texas.
Right. I mean, I think it's always, and we've talked about this. I think after the last poll, we had a discussion about the kind of standard abortion question when Darren Shaw was here. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot lurking in
these questions.
In the categories in that question that I think, are now going to be in a sense, brought out, I think the ambiguities in these positions and the difficulty that we've had, or at least, we talked about this, that I've had in interpreting that question and the results, particularly along partisan lines, is really going to is becoming more apparent at this moment and is likely to become more apparent as we move forward.
Well, I think that's, you're talking about this inflection point piece, and it's sort of, I should say first and foremost, we're talking about the political implications and ramifications about it, not any personal ramifications.
Yeah,
we're just trying to understand this in sort of a broad sense. And I think, when we're talking about the inflection point there, I think that's exactly right. We talk about like kind of the quote unquote standard abortion question. Nobody's happy with these questions because ultimately what you find is that, there's two sort of, at least 2 axes in here that you automatically either acknowledge or ignore, which is like, what are the circumstances that are leading to the abortion? And when is the abortion being gotten, being administered?
And we should say what that standard abortion question is. I mean, we're talking about it.
Right. And so we basically ask, more or less, I actually don't have the wording in front of me.
Yeah, it's a basic, what is your opinion on the availability?
The available abortion. And basically the answers are, it should never be accessible. It should be accessible only in the cases in which the life of the mother is endangered or the pregnancy is the result of rape or incest. There's a third squishier category which says life is endangered, rape, incest.
I mean, just the word, I've got it right in front of me.
Some other stuff.
The wording of that third option, which is the one that's always been, squishiest and problematic in my mind, although if you look at it sideways, it makes sense. Darren did a good job of defending this, as I recall. The law should permit abortion for reasons other than rape, incest, or danger to the woman's life, but only after the need for the abortion has been clearly established.
Yep.
Now, to me, that has always just been terrible phrasing. I get it.
And just as an aside, if you're listening to this, why do you ask it that way? Okay.
Right, and just so that we flesh it out, and then the fourth option is by law, a woman should always be able to obtain an abortion as a matter of personal choice.
Right.
So, you have kind of two variations. It's almost as if the scale, is not symmetrical, right? Which is
the middle of the scale. The
right?
issue is that the middle of the scale is not symmetrical.
Right.
So the idea is, and this is just in terms of interpretation. I think that the key here is that the middle is very squishy on this. I think the idea is that the endpoints tell you something. Endpoints tell you that a minority of Texans, less than 1 in 5, think that abortion should never be permitted.
Yeah, less than 1 in 5, really consistently.
The plurality of Texans consistently express the position that abortion should always be permitted as a matter of personal choice. But then you could say, if you were to look at the categories individually, but then if you combine the categories, say, or an equal share or a plurality think that abortion should be allowed in some circumstances.
Right.
And that's where I think, but this is the issue now. Prior to the Dobbs decision, the idea was, within a certain time frame, those circumstances were kind of, left to sort of the personal discretion of the person, their own moral beliefs, their own situation, right? And then the time frame becomes the issue. Ultimately, even as Republicans in Texas have sort of chipped away at access to abortion, it's almost never been based on the circumstance. It's always been about, the provision of when the abortion is when you can get an abortion, how it's going to be administered, what the sort of, is there going to be an ultrasound, is there going to be a waiting period, what kind of information are we going to give you? But it hasn't been about why are you here?
Right.
But ultimately, this is fundamentally kind of like the it of abortion. But prior to Dobbs, ultimately, if you're just talking about, within a time window and sort of these sort of, it's very abstract. But to me, why this is a watershed. But now we really are getting down to this sort of, when should a woman be able to get an abortion? Because ultimately, most Texans think that a woman should be able to get an abortion at some point. But in Texas, there's only one circumstance in which you can, and that's when their life is endangered. And even that's a little bit murky in terms of how you actually determine that at this point, right?
Yeah, I mean that standard, the threat to a woman's health and life has always been something that opponents of abortion rights have attacked as too vague. Right, as an exception.
And so there's a perfect example of that, I think, banning abortion completely or even close to completely, right? So we say including in the case of rape or in the case of incest, has never had a majority support, including among Republicans. Right. And ultimately the law makes no provision for that. So we kind of hit an interesting point. I said, we're talking about our, again, just as pollsters, eggheads. It's thinking about going ahead, assuming Republicans win majority in the legislatures here in Texas, which there's no reason to assume they won't. Good reason to expect Abbott's still going to be the governor, even if he's not. Is the legislature going to make exceptions for rape and incest next session? Right.
And we should say that, in the last session, this debate did open up more because of the extremity of the Texas law. So there was a more robust discussion in the floor debate and in committee on both timing and conditions. I don't want to sort of obscure that. So, this kind of returns us to the discussion that we had throughout the 2021 session as the 6-week ban with the quote unquote bounty provision was included. I mean, did the legislature and the governor, did the Republican majority in the legislature and the governor go beyond the threshold of Republican opinion and Republican support when they passed both the trigger bill and that 6-week ban in 2021? And even, if they did, how much will it matter in the overall? That's two different questions, but.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in some sense, I think there's sort of two answers, right? It's politically, no. Because politically, the way the discussion had been taking place and was continuing to take place on the trajectory that it was on before the Dobbs decision meant that this was, another example of, I think, Republican legislators passing pro-life laws as they are supposed to do, right? I mean, as they've promised. But now we're into the state of the practicality piece. And I think they pushed on that, right? I think the bounty system was pushing on the practicality piece of this. But now I think, I don't think that they necessarily went too far and kind of within their coalition piece. But now we get to the practical implementation of an outright ban. And I think now they're starting to walk up to a place where, if not too far, it's going to be hard not to go too far.
Well, because, I think I might also add to that, though, that, it may be that I think because of that, they may well, in retrospect, have gone too far, at least with the trigger bill, right? Because I think that, there is a sense of the abstract made real here.
Yeah, absolutely.
That I think, was envisioned, but again, was envisioned in the abstract. And the implementation of this now, is going to involve some real political fights inside the party.
Yes. That
I think are going to resemble the political fights that we saw, 15, 20 years ago, when the preferred way of dealing with abortion in the legislature for a lot of people, even though it went unspoken, was to avoid forcing members to vote on severe restrictions.
Right.
That became sort of non-operative under the conditions in the legislature in 2021, and came close in 2017 and 2019, but never really kind of reached critical mass. In retrospect, you could kind of see it coming. Yeah. And that more of these votes on some of these laws were, getting closer to the floor. And it was taking more effort to keep them off the floor, I think. And those efforts, didn't take place in 2021. Yeah. Right? I mean, I think, you had the Joe Strauss period.
Yeah, I think
where that was, kind of, the previous conventional approach kind of held through much of the Strauss period. But that also became one of the things that the far right dinged and criticized Strauss for as a not real conservative.
Sarah Davis also not in the legislature anymore.
Exactly. And that just kind of broke in 2021. And that really, and so, it's unclear to me what that is going to look like in the next session. I think, to me, that's like one of the questions. On one hand, we're already hearing people talk about, some of the far-right legislators from very safe districts talking about what the next steps are. And look, the advocates in the anti-abortion, sort of organized anti-abortion universe in Texas are already telegraphing where they want to go next on news shows and in interviews, and that is they want to go up to stepping up enforcement. To paraphrase one of those advocates that was on at least Austin television over the weekend, the position was very explicitly, this is a big step forward for us. We think it's great. We still have an agenda, and that agenda is to make sure that enforcement measures are up to, enforcing, the new reality here.
Right.
Even as you're seeing, some of the bigger, more liberal urban areas, of course, Austin among them, sure. but in other areas, looking to curb enforcement.
Yeah, and I think, the combination of the breakdown in leadership sort of to kind of control the discussion, it does create a real sense of exposure when you think about going to the next session, when the question is going to be whether, the Republican leadership is talking about enforcement on the one hand or exceptions on the other. Neither of those are going to be very easy discussions to have within the Republican caucus, right?
Right.
And I mean, the thing that kind of struck me so much about this was like, we keep kind of flirting with this idea of like abstract versus concrete.
Yeah.
And to me, when I think about, again, we were talking about this earlier, where, your view of these sort of debates and the arc of them, it's very much dependent on a lot of things about your own personal circumstances, your age, and kind of where you come from and what laws you're, so I just think that that's just, I just got to put that out there.
Yeah.
But I guess, the thing that I'm sort of thinking about here is, you take sort of the breakdown of the leadership, this sort of difficult set of discussions you're going to have. And historically, the idea is this was really a top-heavy discussion, and it was abstract, right? To the extent we're talking about abortion, that is, and I would say this before, but, this was under the framework that Roe v. Wade existed, and there'd be some allowance for abortion, at least through the first trimester, even if there are little, there are hurdles placed throughout. And the idea is that, I think to the extent we talked about it, it was like, well, what kind of nominees is this president going to put on the courts, right? And that even is sort of a side discussion to bigger issues, right? But now, because the Supreme Court has said not that abortion is illegal, but that it's up to the states, I feel like this discussion becomes much more bottom up. You've already kind of hinted at in the sense of, what is the most conservative Republican in the legislature talking about in their campaign at a candidate forum around this.
Yeah.
Is there video of it? Because, ultimately the question then becomes, well, who else is for this policy, right? I mean, there's something where, usually the idea is like, we think about campaigns being nationalized and sort of, taking in these, sort of big picture kind of macro things. And I think that's still a debate that's going to go on. Republicans are definitely in the day of the Dobbs decision saying, hey, the only thing that really matters is inflation and immigration right now. So this is like, yeah,
right.
Sure. And we can talk about this later, but they'd much rather be talking about inflation and immigration because of these factors that we're kind of laying out here. But now all of a sudden, as you said, like, yeah, Austin may go and, the DA here is not going to prosecute the 6-week ban, right?
Yeah, I mean, the council has been considering a resolution.
But the flip side is there are 254 counties in Texas. Most of them are very rural, very conservative, and have district attorneys who are kind of on their own at the attorney general's direction to still go and start enforcing these things. And ultimately...
And our elected officials.
Yeah, and the context is very different. I mean, like, again, this is, it's not 1955. It's not 1965. These sorts of, horror stories that might come out going forward around this, they're not going to be in the shadows because they're going to be people posting to TikTok. They're going to be posting their stories on Instagram, and the media is going to be covering them in a way that, people are going to have to respond to and react to. And I think the reality of sort of talking about, like, Texas passes, let's say, the ambulatory surgical center, laws in 2013. Well, that kicks off a 2-year legal battle, right? 2-3-year legal battle. Yes, a bunch of clinics closed during that. And then it gets settled and they say, yeah, you can't do that. Well, now the legislature goes and says, okay, we're going to start collecting data from tech companies about, about the travel of women of childbearing years in Texas. There's all kinds of problems that are gonna come up with something like that.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of that is, it's going to take some of that. I think a little while to unspool,
absolutely,
if you will. I mean, there's
a short, medium.
Yeah, I mean, there's a short and there's a sort of time horizon question here. In the nearest time horizon, people are, I took a press call a couple days ago about the potential electoral consequences of this in the upcoming election. And, I think the obvious response to that, which is kind of all over the place, is that, for the most part, below the state level, I mean, at the state level, I think, my sense is this is, we're already seeing this play out. I think the governor is not going to want to talk about this a whole lot.
Yeah.
In general, I doubt there are going to be a lot of campaign ads on this on the Republican side.
No.
And Democrats would like to talk about this because they see a wedge issue among Republicans. And this is a mobilizing issue for Democrats, given that this is a disastrous outcome long anticipated.
I think this was one of the worst hot takes I saw in the wake of this opinion was on TV, the number of sort of anchors saying, well, this has always been such a good mobilizing issue for Republicans. So, Democrats have never really mobilized. And so surely,
right,
the status quo. And it's like, yeah, that's freaking,
I don't think so.
That's dumb. And part of it is like, yeah, you've achieved what you wanted. And, and generally speaking, I mean, I think even a lot of recent history is a pretty good example. It's like, yeah, Barack Obama really got paid handsomely in the midterms for passing healthcare, huh?
Right.
And so the idea that, like, you did what you said you were going to do, and now, like, a bunch of new super pro-life voters are going to turn out. Yeah. I don't think so, but the difference for Democrats is they've been looking in Texas, for example, for an issue to mobilize young, often non-white populations to turn out for the Democratic Party. And ultimately, like, this is not a bad issue for that.
Right. I mean, I think, you've got, we were saying 6 or 7 months ago, and we said this after, we were talking, the same thing came up after we talked about the shootings in Uvalde. We've been saying that the basic contextual conditions of this election really needed, to change for Democrats to be able to have, and certainly for O'Rourke to have a better shot at challenging Abbott and closing the gap. This is another thing that breaks the Democrats' direction. Again, I don't, too soon, don't know if it will be decisive, et cetera. But certainly, of the things that could have happened, and we'd said we were anticipating the decision, didn't know. This was one of the things, and I do wonder if that's already been baked in.
Yeah.
And then I think the medium longer term, I just don't know at this point. And I think the other thing we should say below the state level is that I think this potentially is an issue in some of these suburban areas that are competitive. But the problem is, when you start really trying to dig in and come up with examples of that, it's still a little early. So some of those races are still taking shape.
Right.
And off the top of your head, they're just, because of redistricting, there aren't very many.
No.
We're talking about less than 10 reasonably competitive races, or even races that are more lean rather than locks for the parties.
Yeah, I don't think this changes, much, if at all, the likely outcome of kind of the legislative races. I mean, the one thing I think it does change is the fact that, if you look in those suburban districts, I do think that, in competitive suburban districts where, I think Republican candidates are going to probably be forced by their challengers to answer, policy prescriptions coming out of far more conservative districts. And I think that's going to be a challenge. But as to your point, I mean, so maybe, if that ends up leading to the Democrats winning one or two more seats than they would have already won in the House, not in the Senate, be clear. Well, okay, then the Republicans still have a pretty solid majority. I mean, I kind of said this for a while. I mean, I think, the real issue is, does this make the top of the ticket races more challenging for Republicans? And I think, it's already going to be the most challenging cycle they've had, despite, honestly, the fact that everything else, if we take away this and take away Uvalde and take away the grid, let's say, take those, Republicans would be cruising to victories right now in November, and they may still cruise to victories. But I mean, most of the polling that we're seeing, even before Uvalde, just to be clear, had Abbott in a 4 to 7 point lead range, let's say, right? And with this decision and with all the kind of talk that's going to come out after it and sort of the discussion of it, it's not like Abbott needs to all of a sudden hemorrhage a bunch of support. But, if independents shift a couple points, if, some number of the, let's say, 20% of Republican women who are basically believe that basically abortion access is a right for women to make on their own, decide, I'm just going to sit this one out.
Yeah,
these little things add up, not to necessarily flip it, but all of a sudden, if you're sitting there and you're saying like, boy, this isn't a 5 or 6 point race, this is a 2 point race. Right. Then you get to the point where, circumstances could have an impact leading into election day. So that's, I agree. I'm not sure if it's baked in. I mean, I don't think it's baked in just yet. But.
Yeah. I mean, I think, part of what this raises in terms of thinking about the broader political and electoral context right now, though, is that, this is one more issue after guns where Republican candidates, particularly Governor Abbott, statewide candidates, have to thread the needle a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, there was this broader discussion that we've had here that's going on, more broadly about, whether the Republican Party in Texas and in some cases nationally is occupying positions that don't enjoy majority support.
Right.
And lead to questions like, well, are you really paying attention to everybody, or are you just paying attention to your constituency? Now,
really subsets of your constituency, even in some cases.
And that feeds into some broader things, not just about democracy, but about the mood in the state that we've seen intermittently, but more consistent. I think we're going to start seeing it. We're beginning to see it more consistently in the state, in which there's a real, we were calling it sourness, but I think we've gone beyond sour or dour, to a real sense that things are institutions, general conditions in the state, almost any institution or governing official you ask about, really not viewed very favorably by a huge part of the population. And if you put things in a very partisan framework,
yeah.
But we've seen Governor Abbott's numbers move around, his job approval numbers, including among Republicans, move around quite a bit. And one would say overall decay some. Our right track, wrong track numbers, the general, obviously a lot of this is shaped by the general economy. But I think that, the effort of Republican candidates, again, particular statewide candidates, to blame this all on Joe Biden and to blame it all on the Democrats, I think is likely to become a little less effective going forward. Now, whether the Democrats, because of negative partisan, can actually exploit that, particularly in Texas, beating a dead horse here where Democrats just start from a weak position. But I think this decision is going to feed that a bit more.
I agree with that. I mean, I think, the word that I would, use, I think is just, it's evident in the polling, and this isn't based on some sort of a short timeline or something. This is us looking, through the last housing crisis, over a number of years. There's a lot of dissatisfaction in the state. Now, surely, of course, it's overwhelming among Democrats, but it's also pretty overwhelming among independents.
Right.
And there's not a small share, and there's more than a small share of Republicans who also are expressing this dissatisfaction. And I keep saying, in a sort of colloquial way, if anybody talked colloquially about polling results, it's like, I don't know how long you can play in negative public opinion territory and continue to enjoy, that the kind of support you need to having a governing majority. Now, I do think, to your point here, one aspect of this that's always kind of difficult for Democrats, I'll make the connection here, is, not having competitive local races, which is kind of where we are, doesn't help. Right? Yeah. At the statewide level for this ultimately, in terms of turnout and that kind of thing. Beto O'Rourke benefited in his last run for Senate significantly by the fact that Democrats ran candidates in every district. Trump wasn't on the ballot, but he was an overarching factor, and they were able to turn out voters. Whether they can do that with Biden in the White House, bad economy, or high inflation, let's say, and these other issues, we'll see. But to your point, and I sort of think about this. There's a couple of things here. I think about you brought this up, and I'm going to kind of bring it back around. But it's like immigration is an interesting there's a bunch of different issues you can look at and think, how does this compare or not? And there's sort of this aspect where immigration is a great issue for Republicans. There's no, sort of sense that among the voters that Democrats would do a better job on it in most cases, or at least broadly enough for it to be a good issue for Democrats. And it kind of raises the issues like, is it better for Republicans to solve the immigration issue or to have the immigration issue? And it's clearly better to have the immigration issue. And I wonder about that. Now they've solved the abortion issue, sort of, at least the first stage of it. But the next stage is a lot less advantageous for them than kind of fighting the good fight. And so now they're in this position where, now that they've, kind of gotten what they wanted, is it really as potent of an issue anymore? And furthermore, does it become, a big counter mobilizer? And I think,
it's going to be, I would be surprised if this is not a counter mobilization opportunity for Democrats to some degree. It's just what is that degree going to be? And again, where are independents on this? But yeah, going back to just the larger context for another beat, I think that, there's something to the difficulty that has accumulated over time for Republicans in Texas in being able to, being able to point to the Democrats being a threat or doing it wrong. And this, I think we talked about this a bit last week or the week before, that, at some point you own the environment. And I think we're seeing that, you raised immigration, which was lurking back there, but we had already brought it. But now that it's on there, we had this, we've had this horrible incident in the last, day and a half where we've outside of San Antonio, or in the outskirts of San Antonio, as most people will have heard by now, we've got over 50 migrants that were, undocumented migrants, probably being, by all accounts, being human smuggled,
probably,
into Texas. And some of the response has been, the initial Abbott response was very predictable, was to say, this is the failure of, once again, Joe Biden, has failed to fix the border, and this is what happens when you have open borders. But the logic fails there pretty quickly, given that, if we had an open border, actually you wouldn't have human smuggling, presumably. And so the basic logic is there. Now, look, no politician ever went broke for the most part.
Oh, but the bigger picture,
but the bigger picture there is, you just have been spending
$3 billion
plus
in the last couple of years.
And for Operation Lone Star has now been in effect for a year. Seems like you have some ownership over this problem and over this particular instance. And, that's, it's almost as if, the advantage that we've been anticipating for them on border security and immigration, this was an instance that is not very good for that. It's one thing to have people accumulating at the border as part of a quote unquote caravan. It's another thing to have 50 plus, dead people.
Dying in
your state.
Horrific circumstances.
Very horrific circumstances. And, and the incumbents trying to blame it on, blame it on Joe Biden in a way that's not particularly rational.
No, and that's the thing, and in part, and that ownership thing is key. I mean, I think, again, going back to the whole, this isn't the media environment of the 1950s. We're going to hear a lot of pretty terrible stories over time, and some of that is going to be immediate. Some of it is going to be over time as more of these laws go into effect. And if you say, who owns this? You can't point the finger at Democrats. You can't point the finger at anybody else. This is Texas's laws passed by a Republican majority that's been in control of the state for the entirety of this time. And the thing is it's clear that there is a lot of appetite in the state and even among Republican voters for access to legal and safe abortion in a number of circumstances up to a certain point of time. But there's no indication that there is the will or the leadership in the state to then now craft the law to allow for those exceptions. And in fact, it looks like we're going to go in the opposite direction. And I just, again, this is certainly, I think this goes from an issue that Republicans were like, yeah, if this is an abortion election, let's take it, to let's talk about the inflation.
Right. No, I think that's right. And I think that it's, to the extent that in the broader, in the broadest possible terms of, what the governing coalition, what the governing group is doing in the state and how they respond to voters, they put themselves in a position that's going to be very difficult to be responsive to where public opinion actually is. Now, we've talked about this on the podcast before. This is going to be a real interesting test of the thermostat hypothesis. Yes. Associated with our colleague Chris Lejean, which I think is very useful in a lot of circumstances. Mm-hmm. But whether the institutions and structures that we're seeing in politics right now have changed to the extent that the thermostat may be broken on this, it's difficult, as you say. I think it's very difficult to see responsiveness on this, particularly in the short term or even in the medium term of the next legislative session.
Yeah, and I mean, the question is, if the thermostat's broken, does it need to be tinkered with, or do you need to replace the unit? And I think, that's a question, I think is we're gonna keep having kind of going forward. But I think, your point is a really good one, and I want to make this explicitly. It took 50 years to overturn Roe v. Wade, just about, right? And so I think, for anyone right now who's on the other side of this, thinking about, talking about, like, the answer is not happening tomorrow, and it's not happening in an election cycle. This is going to happen over a number of election cycles in terms of what the fallout to this is. And so, I mean, I think, one of the things that's not helpful, for example, I think, in terms of a way not to mobilize, I think Beto was immediately out after this, saying, well, if I'm governor, I'll overturn all this. And it's like, no, you won't, sir. But I think also there's not likely, but there's an important point to be, honest about. There's like, no, he won't. But the other thing that won't happen is if you don't want, further enforcement around this, that's kind of where you're at right now.
That's going to be the argument, right?
That's the argument right now.
Yeah, I mean, he would not be the first gubernatorial candidate to overpromise what he could do as governor, but that signal is an important one, and how it's received is important. And I think it also, before we close out, it also raises a point that we were talking about before we started that I think is worth raising here, and it is about the, what goes on in the areas of public opinion that are harder to plumb. Yeah. And that is, there may very well be, and I think this gets to goes back to the dissatisfaction with the abortion question, the standard abortion question, but also points to, another way that we've asked this question to foreshadow in a poll that we just got out of the field that we'll be releasing next week.
Data collected just before this decision.
And the data was collected just before the decision, and that is, I think there may have been some folks out there, particularly Republican voters, who may have said, yeah, I'm okay with Roe v. Wade being repealed.
Right.
But may not have quite been fully aware of what the consequences of that were. Oh, but that would mean no abortion exception for rape and incest?
Well, right. And the answer is going to have to get better. I mean, the answer that Abbott originally had months ago to, we're going to eliminate rape, the answer is going to have to get a lot better. Right.
And I think that, once you really, it's going to be interesting to see, like, if that was the case, right? And what I mean by that was the case, when we ask people, and when we've been asking people in polling for, decades, us and others, about Roe v. Wade, what did people really read into that? And when they get what they thought they wanted, how many people were going to go, oh, well, I didn't
Well, yeah.
I didn't think it was that.
Well, Roe v. Wade, I mean, if anything, just to your point, Roe v. Wade is like a marker. It's not that people know what the legal rationale in Roe v. Wade is on average. What it is it's sort of to some extent for a lot of people, it's, your orientation toward it is some version of a statement on whether you consider yourself pro-life or pro-choice.
Right.
But even within those groups, there's a lot of gray area. And that's the main point, I think, to take away from this overall. There's a lot of gray area about what people think about abortion attitudes. And part of that's because it's hard to ask about. Part of that's because there's a lot of dimensionality to it, as we say, a lot of various aspects that matter: time, circumstance, people's own individual morality, etc. But the takeaway, regardless of how you ask it, is that very few people would say never.
Right.
Which is basically where we are right now.
And it's been, a lot of the standard questions, we've broken this down before in the past. We've now tried to do it again. But, at a very practical level, just to be frank, it takes a lot of space on a poll to do that. Mm-hmm. And it's difficult to do it right. And I think, I think the fact that we're going to see a lot more detailed polling on this going forward is going to be an artifact of that. And that detailed polling is also going to have to now engage a whole range of new conditions and new questions about this.
It's going to be a lot different polling on abortion right now, because we are going to have to start asking about enforcement questions, about, specific exceptions. And it's going to be, it's going to take a lot of space and a lot of surveys. But ultimately, the part of it is it's a pretty big thicket.
Yeah. And there's going to be some, and there are going to be, I suspect, we're going to have to sort of be patient on this. It's one of those things where I think we're going to have to be very careful, to not, as we always are, but this is going to be one of those areas. And be very careful to not create opinion before it's polled.
It's true.
Before it's formed.
Yeah, and I think another important thing for people to take away, since you're the podcast with the pollsters here, is just because this is a really big issue and a big decision and it's going to have a lot of political ramifications doesn't mean that it's going to become the driving factor instead of the economy or instead of something else. It may not.
And, and it's almost, I think the other point about, to follow up on the previous point, it's almost as if, this is going to shake, and we started with this, and this is a good place to end. We've noted that these attitudes, as we've asked about them, have been stable for a very long time. Mm-hmm. It will be interesting. We're going to have, it's going to be tricky to be able to track that stability and whether that's disrupted in a way that has continuity with previous questions we've asked, but also cover these new areas. And so that's going to be a big challenge moving forward. So I think with that, I'm going to thank Josh for being here. Thank you for listening. As always, I want to thank our crew in the audio studio here in the Liberal Arts Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin. We've talked about a lot of data here. You can find that data at our website at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. As I suggested, we will have some fresh polling coming out soon. Look for that right after the 4th of July holiday. In the meantime, enjoy that 4th of July holiday. Take a breather. It has been, if you are listening to this and you follow politics, it has been a brutal few weeks. No matter what side you're on, it's been, or what your view or what you're focused on issue-wise, it's been a very busy few weeks. Enjoy the 4th of July, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.